The only Samaritan we've ever heard of is a good one, the Good Samaritan. But every Samaritan they'd ever heard of was bad. And let's take a look at Luke chapter 10, verse 25 and following. A lawyer coming to Jesus, verse 25, to question him. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, well, what's written in the law? What do you read there? And the lawyer says, well, I read that we should love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and strength and love our neighbors ourselves. And Jesus answers, you've answered well. You've answered rightly. Do this and you will live. Now, this leaves a bit of a problem for this particular lawyer, and it's hinted at in verse 29. He wanted to justify himself, and so he said, who is my neighbor? To ask a question when you know the answer seems foolish. I mean, why are you asking? And so maybe he wanted to justify himself to show that he really did have a good question, and he asked further, who is my neighbor? The second possibility is that he knew exactly how difficult it would be to do this. And so he thought, like many Jews of that time thought, if I can restrict the command, maybe I can do it. So if I restrict who my neighbor is, then maybe it's possible for me to love my neighbor. If maybe loving my neighbor is just loving a few people near to me, a few friends and neighbors, then maybe I can justify myself. So Jesus says, okay, I'll answer that question. Who is your neighbor? And I'll answer it by telling you a story. Again, this story is so familiar to us. The traveler is attacked. And it says in verse 30 that they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now what this does is make him into every man. He is not wearing, he probably was still in a loincloth, but he was not wearing any clothes that would tell anybody who he was. He's just a man lying there. He's also speechless. He's unconscious. So he's not able to speak, so no one knows what language he speaks. No one can tell by his accent who he is or where he's from. He's just a man. And so when people see him, they have no idea if he is neighbor or not. A priest happened to be going down the same road and passed by on the other side. Now what we like to do when we tell this story is beat up on the priest. It might be better to view the priest, at least in part, as a victim of his system and of the values of his class. Priests were not permitted to touch the dead. And the priest didn't know if this man was dead or not. Maybe there's a chance of the man being alive, so maybe he can do the right thing. He would have to, quite possibly, go through a lengthy and expensive process of purification. He might lose some income if he was going to be going back to Jerusalem to serve shortly. Since he's not sure who this man is, it's not clear in that culture that he owed him anything. Because if you help a godless man become restored to health, you may simply help him sin more. So the priest is not necessarily, therefore, a cold or evil man. Rather, he is doing what we might say is almost predictable for his day and time. The Levite would be much the same. It's a little bit more complicated with the Levite. The third person who comes, of course, is the Samaritan. And not only is it unexpected that a Samaritan would help, but again, according to the customs of the time, they urged that a Jew not receive help from a Samaritan if they were in need. Because if they fed them or they clothed them and they put oil in their wounds, they would be using what was not tithe. How many of you have gone by somebody in need and then felt bad about it? And it's easy and yet deeply flawed to read the parables too much as just a moral story. What I'd like to do is suggest to you that Jesus himself is visible in most of the parables he tells. The first reason is that Jesus himself says that you can find teachings about him all through Scriptures. Luke chapter 24, verses 44 to 47. Verse 44, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Okay, what's that going to be? And he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures and said, this is what is written. The Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. You are my witnesses of these things. This is what's written all throughout the law of Moses, the prophets, and Psalms. What he's saying is, the Old Testament as a whole predicts me. But it's also true of the New Testament as well. The whole thing is about Jesus. Jesus himself puts himself in several of his parables. And as you read the sower and the parable of the wheat and tares, who is the sower? The sower is the Son of Man. And when he tells the parable of the wheat and the tares, he's saying about himself that there is opposition to his work. In the parable of the lost son, who is the Christ figure? The Father, because just as the Father seeks lost sons, so Jesus seeks lost people. And in the parable of the great banquet, is Jesus there? Absolutely. Jesus is like the host of the banquet, in that he is inviting all kinds of people to himself. Well, how about the parable of the wicked tenant farmers in Matthew chapter 21? The owner says, I want to collect my rent, and he sends messengers, and they beat some, and they threw them out. And then he says, surely they will respect my son. And then, of course, we have Matthew 24 and 25. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. Now, who's the Son of Man? Jesus. So he's saying, my coming will be like the coming of the flood. Now, what was the coming of the flood like? Noah kept saying, one of these days it's going to rain. And everybody said, well, yeah, great. And so they married, and they gave in marriage, and they lived their lives. And then one day it rained. But Jesus says that's the way it's going to be. And then he tells a series of parables, you see, about this very thing, about one who comes like a thief in the night. Well, who's that then? Jesus. And then he tells about 10 virgins who weren't ready for the bridegroom when he came. Who would the bridegroom be? Jesus. And then he talks about someone who went away on a long journey and gave talents to his subordinates and then came back to see, at a sudden, again, unexpected time a little bit, to see how they did with them and call them to account. Who would that be? It would be Jesus. And he told us that. Let me take a look at the next episode with you, the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And the crowds followed him. In fact, they followed him on foot and maybe without really planning things very much. It says in verse 15, his disciples said, this is a lonely place, it's getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus said, that's not right. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. They reply, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. It says in Mark that he kept on breaking. He took those 5 loaves and he kept breaking and breaking and breaking and breaking and breaking and giving and giving and giving. And somehow those loaves never gave out. In fact, there was so much food that 5,000 males ate, plus women and children, let's say 15,000, 12,000. 12 to 15,000 people ate, and 12 basketfuls were left over. And it's a word for a big basket. Kind of like the basket you take your trash out in. Maybe bigger than that even. Enough food for a lot of people for a long time. And then when it's over, an interesting thing happens. And immediately Jesus told the disciples to get into the boat and go on the other side. What's different is there's nothing. Aren't we used to people praising God or saying, who is this? Or we've seen marvelous things today. In chapter 14, verse 22 and following. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus withdraws for a time of prayer. And he sends his disciples on across the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is about 17 miles long, and at its widest point, 8 miles wide. But it says in the 4th watch of the night, they were still tortured by the wind, and Jesus came to them on the water through the wind. They think it's a ghost, verse 26. But Jesus says, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, let me come down to you on the water. This is a perfect picture of the disciples at this phase. Enough faith to get out of the boat. Not enough faith to stay up. Enough faith to go, not enough to endure. Jesus says this to Peter. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you hesitate? In chapter 15, verses 1 to 20, I want to do it very briefly and simply say to you, here's another controversy with the Pharisees. A controversy, in this case, over why Jesus and his disciples don't eat. Jesus says, there are people who honor me with their lips, they have the traditions of men, but their hearts are far from me. It's not what's on your hands that makes you clean or unclean. It's what's in your heart. The Pharisees are opposing Jesus. Next, we have the story of the Syrophoenician woman, which we've studied already, and then I will jump to the feeding of the 4,000, verse 29 of chapter 15. Here again we have great crowds coming to Jesus to be healed, and they are healed, and they're amazed, and they're praising God, which is a little bit better. Jesus said, verse 32, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. The disciples answered, but where can we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Answer, hey, just 40 verses ago in the actual event of Jesus' life, it may have been weeks weeks. We don't really know how long the time frame is between chapter and chapter. And in fact, if they'd really taken in the story, they would know the answer to their question. Calvin said this: all who have once or twice experienced the power of God and distrust it for the future are convicted of unbelief. For faith cherishes in the heart the remembrance of the gifts of God. But nonetheless, Jesus does go ahead, despite their lack of perception. He goes ahead, he takes care of things, and then feeds the people. And immediately after that, chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, back to the Pharisees and their opposition. The Pharisees and Sadducees come to Jesus and ask him for a sign from heaven. He just fed 4,000. He just fed 5,000. He's healed people who are demon-possessed. Besides that, Jesus is not in the business of performing enough miracles to force faith. He's not going to do it. It is rather only a wicked and adulterous generation that looks for a miraculous sign. The only sign they're going to get is the sign of Jonah. That is the sign of the prophet who himself was, for all appearances, dead and then came to life again. That will be your sign. Verse 6, be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And his disciples discuss that among themselves a little bit, and they come to the conclusion, he's upset because we don't have any bread. See, lack of bread is not a problem. And they completely misunderstood. He said, no. You have to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When you say the same thing to somebody twice, and the first time they don't understand it, you say it again, what are you doing? You're implying that if they just listen, they can understand this. And then they get it.